Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where the past is not just remembered, but brought back to life with depth and clarity. An Arab diplomat sits frozen, unable to look away from what unfolds before him. The year is around 921 CE, somewhere along the banks of the Volga River, in what we now call Central Russia. A well-traveled scholar named Ahmad Ibn Fadlan scribbles notes by lamplight. This man has journeyed across the known world, from Spain to the borders of India. He's witnessed customs that would unsettle most people, but nothing has prepared him for what he's seeing the ruse traders do with their captive women. Ibn Fadlan writes with the careful precision of a diplomat whose words will reach powerful readers back in Baghdad. He describes a camp where Viking traders have brought their longships down from the Baltic Sea. They carry furs, amber, honey, and something else, something that fetches extraordinary prices in Arab markets: women. European women seized from villages, monasteries, and estates across the British Isles, the Frankish territories, and Slavic lands. These captives have been transported thousands of miles along river routes and overland paths, processed through trading posts, prepared for markets where fair-skinned northern women command prices that make this brutal enterprise immensely profitable. Ibn Fadlan's account reveals women chained together in groups of 10 or 12, iron collars linked by heavy chains around their necks. They wear thin linen that offers no protection from the river wind. Some bear visible bruises on their arms and faces. Others carry marks suggesting they've been branded or tattooed with ownership symbols. All of them share the same expression, a terrible blankness that Ibn Fadlan recognizes from slave markets closer to home. It's the look of people who've learned that showing emotion brings punishment, that the only safe response is no response at all. One woman catches his attention. She's perhaps 25, with copper-colored hair and skin so pale that bruises stand out like ink on parchment. She sits slightly apart from the others, as far as her chain allows, staring at the river with an intensity that suggests she's not seeing the water at all. She's seeing something far away, something that exists now only in memory. Later, Ibn Fadlan learns she was captured during a raid on a Frankish settlement along the Rhine approximately 14 months earlier. She's been transported by ship, river, and overland trail across more than 2,000 miles. She's passed through 4 different owners, been processed at 2 trading posts where her value was assessed and her price negotiated. She's being prepared for the market that awaits at the end of this river journey, the slave markets of Bulgar, where Arab, Persian, and Central Asian buyers will examine her alongside hundreds of other captives and determine what she's worth in silver. She has a name, but no one here uses it. To the traders, she's merchandise. To the buyers who will examine her, she's a commodity. To the system that has transported her across a continent, she's profit. What Ibn Fadlan documents in his account, confirmed by dozens of other Arab, Byzantine, and European sources, is that the Viking slave trade wasn't some marginal activity practiced by a few rogue raiders. It was one of the largest, most organized, and most profitable forced human trafficking operations in the medieval world. It operated across thousands of miles, processed tens of thousands of captives annually at its peak, connected the forests of northern Europe to the palaces of the Islamic world, and generated wealth that built the Scandinavian civilizations history remembers for their ships and sagas. This is what the historical sources document. This is what you were never taught. The hidden scale. What you're about to learn has been systematically minimized in accounts of Viking civilization that prefer to emphasize exploration, craftsmanship, and maritime achievement. You know about Vikings as explorers who reached North America, as traders who established routes from Scandinavia to Constantinople, as warriors whose raids reshaped Europe's political map. You've perhaps encountered the slave trade as a footnote, an acknowledgement that yes, the Vikings took captives before moving quickly to longships and runestones and the discovery of Greenland. But you've never learned the actual scale of what the Viking slave trade involved. You've never heard that the word slave itself derives from Slav, from the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe, who were the Vikings' most prolific source of human merchandise. You've never encountered the Arab accounts describing Viking trading posts along Russian rivers, where hundreds of captive women were processed for sale at any given time. You've never learned about the specific techniques traders used to prepare women for markets where their appearance, compliance, and apparent health directly determined the prices they would command. Tonight, you'll discover what the historical sources reveal about one of history's largest slave trading operations. You'll learn about the capture networks that supplied captives from across Europe. You'll learn about the processing centers where women were prepared for market. You'll learn about the trade routes that carried them thousands of miles from home. You'll learn about the markets where they were sold and the fates that awaited them after purchase. If you want to understand what Viking civilization actually looked like for the people it consumed, you're in the right place. That copper-haired woman sitting by the Volga River is staring at water that's carrying her further from home with every passing hour. I'm going to tell you exactly how she got there, what was done to her along the way, and what awaited her at journey's end. But first, we need to understand the system that made all this possible. The infrastructure of capture, processing, and sale that turned human beings into the Viking world's most valuable export. The scale of the trade. The Viking slave trade operated on a scale that modern historians are only beginning to fully appreciate. Recent scholarship estimates the trade may have moved as many as several 100,000 captives across Europe and beyond during the Viking Age, a number comparable to the early centuries of the Atlantic slave trade that would follow half a millennium later. The trade operated through an infrastructure with distinct components, each refined over generations of practice. The first component was capture. Viking raiders took captives during attacks on settlements, monasteries, and coastal communities across the British Isles, the Frankish kingdoms, the Iberian Peninsula, and the Slavic territories of Eastern Europe. These raids weren't random acts of violence. They were planned operations, targeting specific populations, timed to coincide with seasonal patterns that made raiding practical, coordinated to produce captives in quantities the trading infrastructure could process. The second component was initial processing. Captives were gathered at collection points, typically coastal encampments or fortified trading posts, where they were sorted, evaluated, and prepared for transport. This initial processing determined captives' preliminary value and likely destination. High-value captives, young women of notable beauty or demonstrated skills, were flagged for premium markets. Lower-value captives were grouped for bulk sale. Those judged unsuitable for any market were killed or released depending on circumstances. The third component was transport. Captives were moved along established routes connecting capture zones to market centers. Western routes carried captives from the British Isles and Frankish territories to markets in Dublin, Hedeby, and other Scandinavian trading centers. Eastern routes carried captives from Slavic territories down the Russian river systems, the Volga, the Dnieper, the Don, to markets at Bulgar, Kiev, and ultimately Constantinople and the Islamic world. The fourth component was final processing. At major market centers, captives underwent intensive preparation for sale. This preparation was specifically designed to maximize sale prices, transforming brutalized, traumatized captives into merchandise buyers would find attractive and valuable. The fifth component was sale and distribution. Markets in Dublin, Hedeby, Bulgar, Kiev, and Constantinople served as distribution points, where captives were sold to final buyers or to secondary traders who would move them further along the network. Each component was staffed by specialists: raiders who captured, handlers who transported, assessors who evaluated, preparers who processed, auctioneers who sold. The slave trade was a professional industry with division of labor, specialized knowledge, and established practices transmitted across generations. The capture, Bridget's story. Let me take you through each stage, using the experiences of specific women documented in the sources. The Irish annals record the Viking raid on the monastery of Clonmacnoise in 920, with a precision reflecting the monks' traumatic attention to detail. The raiders arrived at dawn, approaching from the Shannon River in approximately 15 longships carrying an estimated 300 warriors. The monastery's defenses were minimal: a low wall, a small guard force. The assumption that sacred status would provide protection physical fortifications could not. That assumption had been proven false dozens of times in the preceding century, yet monasteries remained targets because they contained exactly what the Vikings wanted: portable wealth and captive-worthy populations. Among the people taken from Clonmacnoise that morning was a woman I'll call Bridget, a name I'm assigning because the sources don't record her actual name, only her existence as part of the approximately 140 captives documented in the annals for that raid. She was approximately 23 years old, a lay worker attached to the monastery community, literate in Irish and Latin, skilled in textile productio. Qualities that would make her valuable in markets where educated, skilled women commanded premium prices. Bridget was seized during the first minutes of the assault, before the chaos of the raid made orderly capture impossible. The raiders who took her weren't berserkers or frenzied warriors. They were professionals conducting a business operation. They identified valuable captives quickly, secured them with practiced efficiency, and moved them to the ships before the fighting was over. The selection process at the point of capture was rapid but not random. Warriors had been trained to identify markers of value, clothing indicating status, physical characteristics suggesting health and youth, behavioral responses indicating intelligence or spirit. Captives meeting these criteria were taken. Those who didn't, the elderly, the obviously ill, the very young who wouldn't survive transport, were typically left behind or killed. Bridget was bound with leather strips at the wrists, linked to other captives in a coffle, and moved to the ships within approximately 90 minutes of the raid's beginning. By the time the monastery's allies could organize any response, the longships were already moving downriver, carrying their human cargo toward the first processing point. The journey from Clonmacnoise to the Viking settlement at Dublin took approximately 3 days by river and coastal sailing. During this journey, Bridget experienced the first elements of the dehumanization that would continue throughout her captivity. She was kept below deck or in the open hull of the ship, exposed to weather, given minimal food and water, unable to move freely due to her bindings. She wasn't permitted to speak with other captives. Communication between captives was systematically prevented to reduce the possibility of coordinated resistance. She arrived in Dublin on approximately the 4th day after her capture. She hadn't yet experienced the worst of what the system had in store for her. The worst was waiting in the processing facilities Dublin maintained specifically for preparing captives for sale. Dublin, the processing center. Dublin was the largest slave market in the Western Viking world. Founded as a Viking settlement in the mid-9th century, it had developed by the early 10th century into a major commercial center, whose prosperity depended significantly on the slave trade. Archaeological evidence and documentary sources indicate thousands of captives passed through Dublin annually at the trade's peak. Irish, English, Welsh, Frankish, and occasionally Scandinavian captives, taken in raids across the British Isles and beyond. The processing facilities in Dublin were located in the area around the modern Woodquay district, where archaeological excavations in the 1970s uncovered evidence of Viking-age commercial infrastructure, consistent with large-scale slave trading operations. These excavations revealed structures including holding areas, washing facilities, and open spaces suitable for the display and sale of human merchandise. Bridget was taken to these facilities on the day of her arrival. What she experienced over the following days followed protocols the sources describe with enough consistency to reconstruct the standard process. The first step was sorting. New arrivals were divided into categories based on initial assessment of their value. The categories were practical. Women of high potential value who would receive intensive preparation, women of moderate value who would receive standard preparation, and women of low value who would receive minimal preparation before bulk sale. Bridget's literacy and textile skills placed her in the high-value category. She was separated from the common captives and assigned to a holding area reserved for premium merchandise. The second step was physical preparation. High-value captives were cleaned, fed, and allowed to rest before more intensive processing began. This wasn't kindness, it was business practice. Captives who were visibly malnourished, filthy, or injured sold for less than captives who appeared healthy and well-maintained. The investment of a few days' food and basic care typically returned several times its cost in higher sale prices. The third step was detailed assessment. Experienced traders examined each high-value captive thoroughly, documenting characteristics that would affect sale price. Physical measurements were taken. Health was evaluated, skills were tested. Could she weave? Could she read? Could she speak multiple languages? Did she have experience managing households, preparing food, caring for children? Each skill added value, each defect reduced it. The fourth step was what the sources describe most obliquely and what modern readers find most disturbing. High-value captives destined for Eastern markets, particularly those who would be sold to Arab or Byzantine buyers, required specific preparation that went beyond cleaning and feeding. The Eastern markets valued characteristics Western markets didn't necessarily prioritize. Buyers in Constantinople and Baghdad expected merchandise meeting specific standards of appearance, behavior, and compliance. The preparation to meet these standards involved techniques the sources describe in terms requiring careful interpretation. The Arab sources are most explicit. Ibn Rusta, writing in the early 10th century, describes how Rus traders prepared female captives for sale. They treat their slave girls well in matters of clothing and appearance, for they are their merchandise and the source of their profit. They dress them in fine garments. They adorn them with jewelry. They teach them behaviors that will please their future owners. The phrase "teach them behaviors" conceals a process other sources describe in greater detail. The teaching involved not just instruction in deportment and etiquette, but the systematic breaking of resistance and creation of compliance through methods consistent with those documented in other slave trading systems across history: isolation, identity denial, physical coercion calibrated to avoid permanent visible damage, and the psychological pressure of complete dependency. Bridget spent approximately 3 weeks in the Dublin processing facilities. During this time she was transformed from a literate Irish laywoman into merchandise suitable for display and sale, cleaned, dressed, trained in the behaviors expected by potential buyers, broken of whatever visible resistance she might have shown upon arrival. She was then assigned to a consignment destined for the eastern trade routes. The Eastern Route, a journey of thousands of miles. The eastern slave trade routes were the most profitable and most brutal segments of the Viking trading network. Capti Ves, who survived the journey from western capture zones to eastern markets, could sell for 5 to 10 times what they would have commanded in Scandinavian or Irish Norse markets. The price difference reflected both the wealth of eastern buyers and the difficulty and danger of the journey itself. The route from Dublin to the eastern markets followed a path that seems almost impossible in its ambition. Captives were shipped from Dublin across the Irish Sea, through the North Sea into the Baltic, along the coast to trading posts in what is now Sweden or the Baltic states, and then south and east along Russian river systems to market centers on the Volga, the Dnieper, or the Don. From there they might continue to Constantinople via the Black Sea, or to the Islamic world via the Caspian Sea and overland routes. The total distance from Dublin to Baghdad, the furthest major market, was approximately 4,000 miles. The journey could take 6 months or longer, depending on season, weather, and the number of portages required between river systems. Bridget's journey followed the Volga route, the most common path to the Islamic markets. She was transported from Dublin to a staging post in Sweden, then overland, and by river to the headwaters of the Volga system, then by boat down the Volga to the market center at Bulgar, near the confluence of the Volga and Kama rivers. The river journey was the most dangerous segment. The rivers were shallow in places, requiring portages where boats and cargo, including human cargo, had to be carried overland between navigable stretches. Rapids threatened to destroy boats and drown everyone aboard. Hostile peoples along the riverbanks sometimes attacked trading parties. Disease spread quickly among captives confined in close quarters on open boats. The captives traveled in the open hulls of the longships, exposed to sun, rain, wind, and cold depending on the season. They were kept chained to prevent escape. The chains were heavy enough to ensure drowning if anyone went overboard, which served as its own deterrent. Food was whatever the traders could obtain along the route, supplemented by provisions carried from the last major supply point. Water was drawn from the rivers, often contaminated, contributing to the diseases that killed significant numbers of captives during transport. Modern historians estimate mortality rates during transport on the eastern routes ranged from 10 to 30%, depending on the specific route, the season, and the health of the captives at departure. For a consignment of 50 captives leaving Dublin, this meant between 5 and 15 would die before reaching the market, from disease, from exposure, from injuries sustained during portages, from the cumulative effects of malnutrition and physical stress. Bridget survived the journey. She survived approximately 4 months of river travel, multiple portages, inadequate food, exposure to weather, and the diseases that killed several women chained near her. She arrived at Bulgar in late autumn, approximately 5 months after leaving Dublin, approximately 19 months after her capture at Clonmacnoise. She was thinner than when she'd left Dublin. She was weaker. She bore new marks from the journey: calluses from rowing when captives were forced to supplement the crew, bruises from rough handling during portages, the weathered skin of some. One who'd spent months in the open air without protection. But she was alive, and she was about to enter the final stage of processing before sale. Bulgar, the final market. Bulgar, located near the modern city of Kazan in Russia, was one of the great commercial centers of the medieval world, a meeting point where Viking traders from the north exchanged goods with merchants from the Islamic world, from Central Asia, from the Byzantine Empire. The city sat at the crossroads of river and overland trade routes, its markets drawing buyers and sellers from across a vast geographic range. The slave market at Bulgar was among the largest and most active in the medieval world. Arab geographers describe it as a permanent feature of the city's commercial district, operating year-round with peak activity during the summer trading season when river navigation was easiest, and the largest consignments arrived from the north. The preparation of captives for sale at Bulgar was more intensive than what had occurred at Dublin because the buyers at Bulgar were more demanding, and the prices were higher. Arab and Persian buyers expected merchandise meeting standards of appearance and behavior that reflected their own cultural preferences, standards that differed from those of Scandinavian or Irish Norse buyers. The preparation began with what the traders called restoration, the process of reversing the physical damage of the journey and presenting captives in the best possible condition. Captives were bathed in the river. Their hair was washed and styled. Their skin was treated with oils to restore suppleness. They were fed generously for several days to regain weight loss during transport. Juries were treated or at least concealed using techniques the traders had developed specifically for hiding damage that would reduce sale prices. The preparation then moved to presentation. Captives were dressed in garments selected to appeal to the specific market. Eastern buyers preferred styles that differed from Western preferences, and traders who understood these preferences could charge premium prices. Jewelry was sometimes added, not as a gift to the captive, but as display ornamentation enhancing the overall presentation of the merchandise. The final phase of preparation was behavioral. Captives who would be presented to Eastern buyers needed to demonstrate specific qualities: modesty in bearing, submission in manner, compliance with instructions. These qualities were valued by buyers who expected household servants to behave in ways consistent with the cultural norms of their own societies. Captives who couldn't demonstrate these qualities sold for less, or couldn't be sold at all in the premium markets. The techniques for producing these qualities were the same as those used at every other stage of the trade: physical coercion calibrated to avoid visible damage, psychological pressure through isolation and uncertainty, the threat of consequences captives had already witnessed applied to others who failed to comply. Ibn Fadlan's account provides the most vivid description of how captives were displayed at market. Each trader seats his slave girls on a bench before him, and the buyers come and examine them as one would examine livestock, looking at the face, the body, the teeth, opening the garments to see what is beneath. If a buyer is pleased, he negotiates with the trader, and if they agree on a price, the sale is completed. The clinical language of commercial transaction conceals the human reality. Women who had been free, who had families and communities and identities, sitting on benches while strangers examined their bodies and negotiated their purchase prices. Bridget was displayed at the Bulgar market approximately 20 months after her capture. She sat on a bench, dressed in unfamiliar garments, while men she'd never seen evaluated her appearance, her teeth, her physical condition, and her likely utility as a household servant in societies she'd never imagined. She was sold to a merchant from Samanid, Persia, for a price equivalent to approximately 30 silver dirhams, a substantial sum reflecting her youth, her appearance, her demonstrated skills, and the quality of preparation she'd received. The merchant planned to transport her further south to the markets of Bukhara, or perhaps to a private buyer among the wealthy households of the Samanid court. She would never see Ireland again. 5 destinations, 5 fates. Let me now describe the 5 major destinations for Viking traded women using specific cases to illustrate what awaited captives at each endpoint. Norway. Alswith's adaptation. Not all captive women were exported to distant markets. Many remained in Scandinavia itself, serving as domestic labor, concubines, and eventually, in some cases, as wives or mothers of future generations. A woman I'll call Alswith, again, a name assigned because sources preserve her situation but not her identity, was captured during a raid on the coast of Northumbria in approximately 895. She was 20 years old, the daughter of a farmer, whose modest estate had the misfortune of being accessible from the sea. Alswith wasn't flagged for the eastern trade routes. She was assessed as moderate value, healthy and young, but without the exceptional beauty or skills that would justify the expense and risk of transporting her thousands of miles to eastern markets. She was sold at the market in Hedeby, the major trading center on the border between Scandinavian and Frankish territories, to a Norwegian farmer who needed additional labor for his estate in the Trøndelag region. Her fate in Norway was determined by a combination of her owner's character, her own adaptability, and the specific customs of the region where she lived. The Norse legal codes recognized different categories of thralls, with different rights and expectations attached to each category. A household thrall who demonstrated loyalty and capability could achieve a status approaching that of a free servant. A thrall who resisted or proved troublesome could be sold, punished, or killed with minimal legal consequence. Alswith adapted. She learned Norse. She performed the tasks assigned to her: food preparation, textile production, livestock care, the endless domestic labor that kept a Norse farmstead functioning. She bore children whose status was determined by their father's status. If fathered by a free man, they might be acknowledged and given intermediate status. If fathered by another thrall, they would be thralls themselves. The Icelandic sagas, which describe Norwegian and Icelandic society in this period, contain numerous references to women in Alswith's position. Captives who became part of households, who bore children, who contributed their genetic heritage to populations that modern DNA analysis has confirmed contain significant British and Irish ancestry. These women existed in a liminal space, not free but not entirely without agency, not family, but not entirely excluded from the households where they lived. Alswith lived in Norway for approximately 23 years before her death at approximately 43 years of age. She was never freed. She never returned to Northumbria, but she survived, and she left descendants who carried her genetic legacy into subsequent generations without ever knowing her name. Dublin. Edith's isolation. Dublin's slave market served not only as an export hub, but as a domestic market, supplying labor to the Viking and Irish Norse communities of Ireland. Women sold in the domestic market typically remained in Ireland, serving in households in Dublin, Waterford, Limerick, and other Viking-established settlements. An English woman captured during a raid on the Somerset coast in approximately 910 provides an example documented in fragmentary sources. Her name was Edith, one of the few captive names sources actually preserve, and she was approximately 26 years old, the wife of a merchant whose trading vessel had been intercepted at sea. Edith was sold in Dublin to a Norse-Irish household where she served as a domestic laborer for approximately 7 years. Her experience illustrates the particular conditions of slavery in the Irish-Norse context, where Norse and Irish cultures mixed in ways that created distinctive social patterns. The Dublin household where Edith served included free Norse, free Irish, and enslaved people of various origins. The social hierarchy was complex. Irish-born free women sometimes held higher status than Norse-born thralls, and interactions between free and enslaved people were governed by customs that blended Norse and Irish traditions. Edith's English origin made her culturally distinct from both Norse and Irish members of the household. She was an outsider to both communities, belonging to neither, understanding the language and customs of neither group fully. This isolation intensified the psychological effects of her captivity. She wasn't merely enslaved but culturally adrift, cut off from any community that might provide the social support humans require. She was eventually freed under circumstances the sources don't fully explain, possibly manumission by her owner, possibly purchase of freedom through accumulated work. She apparently remained in Dublin after freedom, having nowhere else to go and no means to return to a home that may no longer have existed. Constantinople, the regulated market. Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the richest city in the Christian world, was a major destination for Viking-traded women. The Byzantines maintained a complex system of domestic slavery that created constant demand for new captives, and Viking traders operating along the Dnieper River route supplied a significant portion of this demand. The journey from capture to Constantinople followed the Dnieper route through what is now Belarus and Ukraine, past the rapids that Emperor Constantine VII described in his work De Administrando Imperio, and into the Black Sea for the final sea crossing to the imperial capital. A woman from a Slavic village in what is now Poland provides an example. She was captured during a Rus raiding expedition in approximately 930, transported down the Dnieper with approximately 60 other captives, and sold in the slave market at Constantinople after a journey of approximately 3 months. The Constantinople market was the most sophisticated in the Viking trading network. Byzantine law regulated slave sales extensively. Buyers could return defective merchandise, sellers were required to disclose known health problems, and specific taxes were levied on each transaction. The market operated in designated areas of the city, with different sections for different categories of merchandise. Women sold in Constantinople entered a Byzantine household system that was, by the standards of the medieval world, relatively regulated. Byzantine law established limits on how slaves could be treated. Religious institutions occasionally intervened on behalf of mistreated slaves, and the path to freedom, while difficult, was at least legally established. Manumission was recognized and practiced, particularly when slaves converted to Christianity, but regulation didn't mean comfort. Byzantine households could be harsh environments for enslaved women who performed domestic labor under conditions entirely controlled by their owners. The legal protections existed on paper but were difficult to enforce in practice, and the cultural distance between a Slavic village and a Byzantine urban household was enormous. The language, the customs, the social expectations, the religious practices, all were foreign to captives who'd never imagined anything beyond the world they'd been taken from, the Islamic world. Bridget's final destination, the Islamic markets, Baghdad, Bukhara, Samarkand, and the cities of the Samanid and Abbasid empires, represented the most distant and most lucrative destination for Viking traded women. The prices commanded in these markets were the highest anywhere in the trading network, reflecting both the wealth of the buyers and the extraordinary distance and difficulty of the supply chain that delivered merchandise to them. This was Bridget's destination. The Irishwoman captured at Clonmacnoise, whose journey along the Volga route I described earlier. After her sale at Bulgar, Bridget was transported south by caravan to the Samanid territories in what is now Uzbekistan and Iran. The journey took approximately 2 months, crossing steppe and desert terrain that presented yet another set of physical challenges for captives already weakened by months of travel. She arrived at her final destination approximately 22 months after her capture. Nearly 2 years of continuous travel, processing, and sale that had carried her from a monastery on the Shannon River in Ireland to a household in Central Asia. A distance of approximately 5,000 miles, what awaited her in the Samanid household was a form of slavery that differed in important ways from what she might have experienced in Scandinavian or Irish-Norse contexts. Islamic law regulated slavery more extensively than Norse custom did. The Quran established specific rights for enslaved people: the right to adequate food and clothing, the right to humane treatment, the right to purchase freedom through agreed-upon payments. Concubines who bore children to their owners achieved a special legal status, walad, mother of the child, that protected them from sale and entitled the to freedom upon their owner's death. These legal protections were meaningful, but they existed alongside practices the protections didn't address. The journey to reach this destination had been brutal. The preparation for sale had involved systematic destruction of previous identity. The cultural displacement was total. Bridget was now in a world where everything she'd known was irrelevant, where the skills and knowledge that had defined her in Ireland meant nothing, where she had to learn an entirely new language, entirely new customs, entirely new ways of existing. Arab sources describe the lives of Northern European women in Islamic households, in terms suggesting a range of outcomes. Some women adapted successfully, learned Arabic, converted to Islam, bore children who became free members of their fathers' families, achieved status that would have been impossible in their original societies. Some women never adapted, living out their lives in a state of permanent cultural displacement, functioning but never belonging. Bridget's specific fate cannot be determined from the sources. She disappears into the vast household systems of the Samanid Empire, one of thousands of Northern European women absorbed into Islamic societies during the Viking Age. Whether she found some form of accommodation with her circumstances, whether she bore children who knew nothing of their Irish heritage, whether she died young or lived to old age, these questions cannot be answered. What can be said is that she never returned to Ireland. The distance was too great, the obstacles too numerous, the possibility of return too remote to sustain even as a hope. She was gone from her homeland as completely as if she'd died, and for the people she'd left behind, she might as well have. The secondary markets, an endless journey. Not all captive women reached a final destination through a single sale. Many passed through multiple transactions, sold and resold as their value fluctuated or as their owners' circumstances changed. These secondary sales could carry women further from home, into situations they couldn't have anticipated, toward fates that depended on the accidents of commerce, rather than any deliberate plan. The case that best illustrates this pattern involves a Frankish woman documented in multiple fragmentary sources, captured in a raid on a settlement along the Loire River in approximately 915, sold first at a market in Rouen to a Norse trader, then resold at Hedeby to a trader working the eastern routes, then transported to Bulgar where she was sold to a Khazar buyer, and then apparently resold again to a buyer in the Caucasus region. Each sale was a new trauma. Each transfer meant a new owner with new expectations, new customs, new rules that had to be learned under threat of punishment. Each destination was further from home, further from any possibility of rescue or return, further from anyone who shared her language or her culture. The secondary markets ensured captive women could end up virtually anywhere in the known world. European women have been documented in archaeological and textual evidence from locations as distant as Central Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East. The Viking trading network didn't merely move captives from point A to point B, it fed them into a continental system of human commerce that distributed them across thousands of miles in patterns reflecting market forces rather than any individual's intentions. The evidence, the Viking slave trade, is documented in multiple categories of surviving evidence that modern scholarship has only recently begun to synthesize into a comprehensive picture. The written sources include Arab geographical and travel accounts, Byzantine administrative records, Norse sagas and legal codes, Irish and English chronicles, and Frankish administrative documents. Each category provides different types of information, and taken together they provide a remarkably detailed picture of how the trade operated. The archaeological evidence includes excavations at major trading centers, Dublin, Hedeby, Burka, Bulgar, and others, that have uncovered physical infrastructure consistent with large-scale slave trading operations. Chains, collars, and other restraints have been found at multiple sites. The spatial organization of trading centers reveals areas designated for the holding and display of human merchandise. The numismatic evidence, the study of coins, reveals the flow of wealth through the trading network. The massive quantities of Arab silver found in Scandinavian hoards demonstrate the scale of commerce between the Viking and Islamic worlds, of which the slave trade was a major component. The distribution patterns of these hoards trace the trade routes described in the written sources. The genetic evidence, particularly from Iceland, provides biological confirmation of the captive-taking patterns described in written and archaeological sources. DNA analysis of Icelandic populations shows approximately 62% of female ancestral lineages come from the British Isles, primarily Irel and Scotland, while approximately 80% of male ancestral lineages come from Scandinavia. This asymmetry strongly suggests large-scale importation of British and Irish women into Icelandic society, consistent with captive-taking during the Viking Age. The numbers, estimating the total number of women who passed through the Viking slave trade, is difficult, but modern historians have attempted calculations based on multiple categories of evidence. The Arab sources provide some data. Ibn Khordadbeh, writing in the 9th century, describes the Viking trade routes and implies regular, large-scale traffic in human merchandise. The volume of silver dirhams found in Scandinavian hoards, approximately 100,000 coins discovered by archaeologists, provides indirect evidence of the scale of commerce between the Viking and Islamic worlds, of which the slave trade was a major component. The Irish annals record specific raids and the numbers of captives taken, providing data points that can be extrapolated to estimate broader patterns. Between approximately 800 and 1,000, the annals document hundreds of individual raids, many of which explicitly mention captive taking. Synthesizing these various lines of evidence, modern historians estimate the Viking slave trade may have moved between 200,000 and several 100,000 captives over the approximately 250 years of the Viking Age. Women constituted a significant majority of this trade, because female captives were more valuable in most markets, and because the various demand functions, domestic labor, concubinage, status display, applied primarily to women. These numbers are estimates subject to significant uncertainty, but even the conservative VE estimates indicate a trade of enormous scale, one of the largest forced human trafficking operations in the pre-modern world, sustained over centuries, reaching across continents, consuming hundreds of thousands of lives. The human cost. Modern psychologists and trauma researchers who have studied the effects of human trafficking recognize patterns in the Viking slave trade that remain constant across different eras and cultural contexts. The progressive dehumanization captives experienced, from the moment of capture through transport, processing, display, and sale, follows patterns that modern trafficking researchers have documented in contemporary contexts. The isolation from support networks, the destruction of previous identity, the conditioning of compliance through alternating coercion and intermittent kindness, the commodification of the person into a product. These techniques appear in trafficking operations across history because they work. The psychological effects on captives are equally consistent across eras. The traumatic response to capture, the dissociation that develops as a coping mechanism during transport, the conditioned compliance that replaces active resistance, the identity confusion that results from prolonged immersion in alien cultural contexts, the complicated attachments that develop between captives and captors or owners. These patterns appear in the Viking Age sources and in modern trafficking research, confirming that the human psychological response to such treatment is remarkably consistent, regardless of cultural or historical context. The long-term effects documented in modern trafficking survivors and suggested by the fragmentary evidence from the Viking Age include chronic anxiety, difficulty forming relationships, identity confusion, and the complex grief that comes from permanent separation from everything and everyone familiar. Remember their names. For Bridget, the woman captured at Clonmacnoise, who was approximately 23 years old when Irish monks recorded the raid, who traveled 5,000 miles from a monastery on the Shannon to a household in Central Asia, who disappeared into the vast systems of the Samanid Empire and was never heard from in Ireland again. For Alswith, captured on the coast of Northumbria, who was 20 years old when she was sold at Hedeby, who spent 23 years as a household thrall in Norway, who bore children whose descendants carry her genetic legacy without knowing her name, who died at 43, still enslaved and still far from home. For Edith, captured at sea off the Somerset coast, who was 26 years old when she was sold in Dublin, who served 7 years in an Irish Norse household, who was eventually freed into a world she no longer recognized as her own. For the copper-haired woman whom Ibn Fadlan observed on the banks of the Volga, the woman who sat apart from the others, staring at the river with an intensity that suggested she was seeing something beyond the water. She was perhaps 25 years old, a Frankish captive 14 months into a journey that had carried her more than 2,000 miles from home, waiting for a market that would determine the rest of her life. Her name was not recorded. Her fate was not documented. She exists in history only as a single paragraph in an Arab diplomat's travel journal, a glimpse of one person caught in a system that consumed hundreds of thousands, for the thousands of women transported along the Volga route, and the Dnieper route, and the overland routes that connected northern Europe to the markets of the East, for those who survived the journey and those who did not, for those who found some accommodation with their fates and those who never could, for those whose descendants carry their genetic legacy across populations that have forgotten where that legacy came from, for the uncounted women sold at Dublin and Hedeby and Burka and Bulgar and Constantinople and Baghdad and all the secondary markets between, for those who passed through the hands of traders who saw them only as merchandise, for those who were examined like livestock by buyers who saw them only as commodities, for those whose entire lives were determined by commercial calculations that had nothing to do with their own desires or their own humanity. They were not merchandise. They were women with names, with families, with dreams, with identities that the system sought to erase but could never fully destroy. This is their story. This is what the sources reveal. This is what history tried to forget. But we remember.